And now we speak with independent journalist, activist, and instigator of the DNC fraud lawsuit, veteran Niko House. Thank you for joining us, Niko.
Thanks for having me on, Liz. I appreciate it.
I've been covering this story for a long time. I've talked to you multiple times before for news articles on the DNC lawsuit and other related stories. But can you describe for the audience what your role in the DNC fraud lawsuit was and your activity as a Bernie Sanders supporter and activist, and how you got involved in the whole process of documenting some of this really awful corruption within the primary process of the DNC in 2016?
To make a very, very long story short, I was the acting state director for Bernie's North Carolina campaign. I was also the president of Carolina Students for Bernie Sanders at UNC, and I was also the state director or the president of North Carolina colleges for Bernie Sanders. So I was really busy that year, as you can imagine. So in the midst of that, I discovered some rigging through a lot of the proxies we had throughout the state that were tracking some, suspicious activity, but then closer towards the North Carolina primary, we started piecing everything together. And there was one situation where someone tried to tell me that a Bernie Sanders staffer was fired and I couldn't talk to them. But they didn't know that I actually talked to that Bernie Sanders staffer all the time. And so I was able to call that person, like, hey, you fired? And they were like, no. I was like, okay. So remember that conversation that we had? Because I was talking to this person about what we had been seeing this entire time. I was like, yeah, we need to blow the whistle on it. And we found out, of course, later on that obviously there was a lot of different forms of rigging going on, from the Hillary Clinton Victory Fund, which we also broke, to, the superdelegates, to out and out rigging by putting people from various super PACs, various consulting firms, or people who directly have worked for Clinton before inside of Bernie Sanders' campaign at different, not like at the highest levels necessarily, but at the important levels on the ground. And so with that information, I did a video exposing all of it. Jared and Elizabeth Lee Beck got in touch with me, and we put our heads together and we came up with the DNC fraud lawsuit.
Yeah, so Jared and Elizabeth Lee Beck are the attorneys for the plaintiffs in the DNC fraud lawsuit. And they credit your instigation of that suit in Jared Beck's book, What Happened to Bernie Sanders, which everyone should read if they're interested in that suit, because it's one of the most important, political events, I think, in our current era that happened. The rigging of the nomination against Bernie Sanders and the exposure of that. I mean, we can say that politics is rigged much of the time, but what was so critical and what your work did that was so critical was helping expose that. It was exposed in a way that we just haven't seen before and really can't expect to happen again. Do you think that we'll see any similar exposure of rigging or bias in 2020?
So I think we'll see some rigging. And it won't look the same though. There's almost no way it can look the same because there's a huge difference. All of the establishment was consolidated behind Hillary Clinton for various reasons. Some legitimately supported her. Some didn't like Bernie because he's was considered an outsider. Others were just looking for a job. They were looking for a check. And I would say that the latter is probably the most important reason why people consolidated behind Hillary Clinton. And because, let's be honest, you could come up missing if you don't back her. So there's that. But in all seriousness, we look at what Tulsi, Hillary Clinton's grip over the Democratic Party was so strong that it was a surprise that Tulsi was standing up to her, to the point where people were legitimately worried about her life, as Tulsi revealed in the interview that she had directly after she left the DNC as vice chairwoman. So it's not like, this is a different situation. Nobody's scared of Biden like they were scared of Hillary. Nobody is counting on Biden's fundraising like they were counting on Hillary. They tried to pick their candidate. It was Kamala. Thankfully for Tulsi, the enigma that is Kamala, which we thought was going to be a noose around our necks for the next year, is gone now. So, and Biden, we don't know how long he'll last. Warren's basically their strongest candidate now. And so they don't know where to put their dollars at. They put a lot of money behind Kamala at that Hamptons meeting in New York. All of Hillary Clinton's donors, most of her consultants and staffers went to Kamala's campaign. And she's done. So now you got to look at Elizabeth Warren. I don't know what's going to happen with her, but I don't know. They find her acceptable. and compared to Bernie or Tulsi or even Yang. But the fact of the matter is, it's kind of like up in the air as to who they can consolidate behind. So what we'll see is there might be a different type of election integrity issue and a different type of rigging, just maybe media bias. There were definitely, depending on, I think there could be some fraction magic taking place where no matter how many votes one candidate gets over the other, they'll just make sure that the percentages stay the same. But once again, it's much harder to do that with so many popular candidates running at once. So I think towards the middle of the primary season, we may begin to see more rigging as the races get closer and as the candidates kind of, the field slims down. But in the beginning, I think it'll be much more difficult to out and out rig it in the same way that Hillary Clinton did.
And that's an interesting point too. It's an interesting point to look at the race and see the DNC Democratic establishment figures kind of look almost confused as to who to back. There's a lot of rumors circling around that the answer may become in the form of Hillary Clinton actually throwing her hat in the ring again. How likely do you think that is?
I never underestimate Hillary Clinton's ego. And there are rules that supposedly prevent her from entering the primary at a certain time. Like technically, I think right now she shouldn't be able to run in like New Hampshire's Democratic primary. But like if she wins all the superdelegates from New Hampshire in the second round, it won't matter. Right? So exactly. I never underestimate Hillary Clinton's ego. And I also never underestimate the ability for the DNC to change its rules whenever they feel like it. I mean, literally, Bernie suspended the rules in order to endorse Hillary. So you can suspend the rules and do what the hell you want to do at the end of the day. So I think that it's realistic. I think that if it becomes a standoff between Warren, but Warren looks like she's getting beat, right? So if it's between Warren, Bernie, and I think that it'll be between Warren, Bernie, and either Yang or Warren, Bernie, and Tulsi because of the amount of open primary states there are. And if Warren looks like she's catching a beating, Buttigieg can't win in most of the states. Like he's going to get obliterated in most of the firewall in the South. I don't know what option do they have left. I legitimately do not know. It would be basically they would probably, to be real with you, because I think at this point everybody can agree that the biggest threat to the establishment, or at least from their perception, is Tulsi. Not just because of where she stands domestically, but because she's out here standing with the victims of 9/11, demanding transparency and declassifying the 9/11 files that could implicate Saudi Arabia, potentially the Mossad, people domestically, and all the other candidates ignored them. So when you have somebody who's willing to call it the not only the domestic establishment, but the foreign policy establishment as well, they're perceived as more dangerous, and you may even begin to see them consolidate resources behind Bernie.
Well, not only go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because you can consolidate resources behind Bernie, and you can essentially control the long-term outcome by saying, look, we won't rig it against you. We'll even work with you. However, we're picking your VP. And unfortunately, Bernie has made compromises like that in the past. And I genuinely believe he thinks for some reason that Warren is a progressive, and they'll get what they want if Bernie picks Warren as a VP. So that's a whole different type of way that they can rig it. A lot of people don't discuss, but if they get Warren as a VP, then they won anyway.
In addition to the unique aspects of Tulsi's campaign as far as policy, I just want to add that in agreement to what you just said, that I think that it's really interesting the way that she not only has such a different foreign policy and take on foreign policy in general, she also has a unique courageousness when it comes to speaking truth to power, when it comes to the corruption in the DNC. As you referenced earlier, she did step down as vice chair of the DNC in 2016, whereas we didn't see Bernie really come out against the rigging against him almost at all. So she's really been the only person.
He defended the DNC at that during the interview with The View when crazy enough, Meghan McCain was like, "Do you feel like you should be defending her and standing up?" Because like I think that everybody with eyes and ears can see like clearly they're rigging the outcome. It's very ambiguous as far as who gets on the debate stages, who gets exposure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually said, well, you can't really blame them. They weren't expecting, or they have too many candidates. Everybody can. I'm like, but they chose to put this many candidates out there. That was their goal. And so when you compare Tulsi's conviction as far as holding the DNC accountable and the Democratic Party accountable, they've always had this weird beef with Tulsi. Oh, and a lot of people don't know that because at one point they thought she was a champion. but it's because she got into politics so young because of her family. Her family dad used to be Republican, was into politics. That's one of two options. Either you try your hardest to co-opt her now, or you're going to deal with her no matter what later. So they tried that. But people forget, Tulsi was introducing legislation to get out of the war in Syria in 2015. She was telling the world that we were funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS in 2015. Not in 2019. I mean, she does it in 2019 too, but in 2015. And so even with that, the conversation where they always try to throw out there, well, she's Islamophobic. And then when you ask why, they always point to that one interview where she says Obama would not call these radicals what they were. The context was because we keep calling them moderate rebels. Right. And we are funding radicals. And it was specifically in reference to situations like what we're seeing in Syria. And that's the context that doesn't get discussed. So they try to portray her as demonizing Obama and then demonizing Muslims. But what it really was the conversation that we're having today, she was still having in 2015 and being smeared in 2015, just like she's being smeared today. So the DNC has always had an interesting bone to pick with Tulsi, although they celebrated her when, she first got elected to Congress, and, she spoke at the 2012 Democratic National Convention. She was invited to speak there. But when she she was being propped up to be Hillary's successor, it would have been a walk-off home run for her. Didn't matter. They didn't she could have had it all, and she gave it up.
So returning for a moment to the DNC fraud lawsuit, because I'd really like to discuss that for those who were not, haven't been following it the whole way through. Could you outline a little bit for us the degree to which DNC Defense Counsel actually said not only do they have the right to rig, but it's protected by the First Amendment? And the one thing I want to just say before I let you kind of just outline it is they actually said that they claimed that Bernie Sanders supporters knew that the primary was rigged. And so therefore it couldn't have been fraud. So if you could just outline that for those who aren't familiar with the story.
So basically, Jared argued that according to their own charter, which is 100% true, the DNC does not have a right to rig the primary, and they must act objectively and even-handedly. He told the judge, I think his name is Bruce Spiva. I want to say his name.
I think that was the defense counsel. I think that was the defense counsels. Yeah. Yeah.
And he told the judge that the judge cannot rightfully adjudicate what is objective and even-handed. That was an interesting claim, by the way, which the judge kind of scoffed at. As far as even in the dismissal for that one, he was like, "Well, you crazy? Like, don't tell me what I can and can't adjudicate. That's why I'm here." So it was that. But then whenever Jared challenged him on their own charter, and even Judge Locke, who was the federal judge for that case, when he was like, "Well, does this charter say this or not?" Yes, it does. However, we don't have to follow the charter, is basically what he said. And then he said that the DNC could pick who they want. So it doesn't matter who votes. He said, Bernie could win all the delegates. And if the DNC chooses Hillary Clinton, then that's what they choose. And that was their entire argument. And then he, like you said, he argued that we knew the primary was rigged. So in other words, he admitted that the primary was rigged. He admitted it in court that the primary was rigged, that we as Bernie supporters knew it was rigged. We had a feeling, we didn't know. But it was obviously later confirmed that in fact it was rigged via the WikiLeaks, via a lot of the other stuff that we had figured out at that point. So he argued this in court, of course. And funny enough, people like TYT actually defended him. They said that it was a sore losers, despite the fact that we actually started this lawsuit not knowing the outcome. We started this lawsuit long before California had even taken place. I think it was even before Illinois had taken place, if I recall. And so the race was by no means over. It was actually very, very, very close, but we knew that it shouldn't even have been that close based off of the exit polling and all the other stuff that had taken place. So, even if you want to talk about the amount of debates, if there was more debates that would have been had, it would have not even been that close, even probably with the rigging. So when you look at just the representation from the DNC and how audacious they are with asserting this, entitlement to choosing who the hell they want, despite the fact that they get state funding. A lot of public funding comes from these states. They get federal funding. They're subjected to federal Elections Commission's laws. And And if I violate a federal law, a federal voter law or a state voter law, while I'm voting in a primary, I can be held accountable. So why should you not be held to the same federal and state legal standards that I'm in? But that's what they argue.
And it's so important now, as we do head into 2020, to remember that history. It's so important to revisit that, because we have people, we can sit around all day talking about, well, it's going to be Kamala, or it's going to be, previously Beto before he stepped down. But the thing is that it does not matter as far as popularity. We talk about messaging, we talk about resonance with these politicians and the base, but it's a charade. And that's what the DNC Fraud lawsuit showed us. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about it now. And I think that, and in addition to the DNC fraud lawsuit, we also saw a lot of confirmation of the rigging that you've discussed. You say, we kind of had that gut feeling that it was happening. Recently, there was an article that basically discussed indications of voter fraud, where the states that used voting machines.
Election fraud or voter fraud?
Let me
there is voter fraud, but it's generally voter fraud is done more so at the local levels. We're in primaries too, though.
Let me just give the explanation of what happened, because it's a really interesting article. It said that basically the states that used electronic voting machines gave it away to Hillary by a wide margin. But the states that used paper ballots showed a narrow victory by Bernie. So whichever phrase you want to use for that, that was really interesting. And that article only came out in the last couple of months. Almost 4 years after this happened, we still are getting articles about that type of...
I'll do you one better.
Go right ahead, please do.
Except for Iowa, where they're tied, all the caucuses went to Bernie. It's not a coincidence either. It's weird. So you're telling me the place where you can't rig the voting machines, Bernie wins? Oh yeah, what a surprise.
Exactly.
It's not surprising. When we look at what happened with Tim Canova, which is obviously significant.
That was going to be my next question for you. Yeah, absolutely. Please go there. That was the next thing to talk about.
For those of you who don't know, Tim Canova won a lawsuit where 200,000 plus ballots were destroyed by Brenda Snipes, who was one of the people on the payroll for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Literally, we caught her campaigning for Debbie Wasserman Schultz too, interestingly enough.
And I'd like to splice that. Election. I'd like to splice the picture of them campaigning together into this, because I think it's important people actually witness that. But
and when Tim sued, honestly, I wasn't expecting any type of positive outcome, except for the federal judge found Brenda Snipes guilty, and Tim Canova won a significant settlement. But Brenda Snipes destroyed several 100,000 ballots from the 2016 primary election. And a lot of people, I think this flew a little too under the radar, in my opinion, because people are only thinking about, and of course, I believe it was covered like in the way it was on purpose, where they only mentioned Tim Canova and Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Brenda Snipes. But the part that doesn't get discussed is, who do we know for a fact? If you voted for Tim Canova, who did you probably vote for on that exact same ballot?
Bernie Sanders.
It was probably Bernie in 2016. We can assume that, it was probably, Tim probably won, right? I think that a lot of people would agree with that. Tim probably won, but it was probably by a small margin, just because of how much of a chokehold Debbie Wasserman Schultz had. But I think the more important thing is whatever technique they use to rig it for Debbie Wasserman Schultz, because that district, a lot of people don't know, one of the largest districts in the country, and definitely the largest district in Florida. And so if Tim wins that district, Bernie wins that district, and if Bernie wins that district, he probably wins Florida.
Exactly.
That's the whole narrative changes. And they were willing, think about it, they were willing to go out on such a limb to blatantly destroy paper ballots, knowing that Tim is not the type of person that's going to ignore something like that, just to maintain a stronghold in that particular district. This is the same district where Ron DeSantis is trying to fight for control of the school districts, because Debbie Wasserman Schultz and her goons have been funneling millions of dollars out of the school district every year. So like Elijah Manley had his life threatened for running for school board at large against Debbie Wasserman Schultz's pick, because that's how much money flows through that school district. So this is a significant story for a plethora of reasons that didn't get I feel like it didn't get covered the way it should have. Not just what happened with Tim Canova and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but all of the surrounding circumstances that could have been affected by Brenda Snipes destroying that ballot. Now, here's the significant thing about accountability and demanding it. It doesn't always necessarily work out how you think it's going to work out. Like, I never thought that Brenda Snipes was going to go to jail or something like that. Never thought that. However, because Tim has been consistent and persistent in demanding accountability for rigged elections, Brenda Snipes is no longer the supervisor of elections in Broward County. And in addition to, because of Tim running as an independent, and then we found rigging in that particular election as well. I mean, people literally taking ballots by themselves to their personal vehicles and just driving off with them. Another person, when she was counting ballots and moving them around, literally moved the machine in front of the window so that election observers couldn't see what was going on. And we got all this on video.
And that's one of the reasons I also wanted to speak to you in this segment of CN Live, is because not only were you involved in the DNC Fraud lawsuit, but because you were a supporter of Tim Canova in both of his races, if I'm correct, you were a witness to a lot of this improper vote counting, improper vote transportation, ballot transportation. And so I wanted to also, though, back up for people who, because the mainstream media did not cover this story, don't even know what you're talking about when you say Tim Canova and Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And it may not be everyone, but there are probably a few out there who really don't know what we're talking about. So Tim Canova, tenured law professor in Florida, ran against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the disgraced DNC chairwoman, of course, who resigned in 2016 because of the revelations of rigging against Sanders within the DNC. She was running for her the primary race for her congressional district in Florida in 2016. Canova ran against her in that primary race, and the outcome was pretty close, but Canova only narrowly lost as far as the vote count was concerned. He then
I think it should also be mentioned that at that point, Canova had set the record for congressional candidate fundraising. So he had set the record. Bernie backed them. So.
And that's really noteworthy, because he was coming from a place of being a relatively unknown figure in politics in Florida. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah.
So basically, definitely. So essentially, then you mentioned the ballot destruction. So Canova basically tried to look at the ballots to check them, because there were concerns about the vote counting process, the tally process. And that is when Brenda Snipes, a few months later, signed off on the destruction of those ballots, signing her name, saying there was no pending litigation in which the ballots were being contested or being involved, which was then found to be illegal in a summary judgment. It was found to have been multiple felonies. Brenda Snipes kept her job as supervisor of elections for Broward County, was not prosecuted, all the way through to the next election in 2018, in the midterm election, when Canova then ran as an independent, not in a primary against Wasserman Schultz this time, but as an independent in the general election. So sorry for the
and somehow got less votes. But
yes,
got
exactly.
Less votes.
That's another point. So yeah.
And when I say he got less votes, I don't mean just him. I mean literally, they got more votes running in the Democratic primary election than they did in the general election. And what's even more interesting is that there were the total votes for that district, right? Once again, largest district in the country, or one of the largest districts in the country, largest district in Florida, about 800,000 votes. They only got like 280,000 of those 800,000 votes. Now, that wouldn't be that weird if we're talking about maybe a school board or even a local state, state candidate running for state senate, running for state legislature. But that's not the case. Right. This is the representative for your district for the United States of America. The reason you were put in this precinct and called this district is for this very specific reason. And they got 500,000 or so less votes compared to the amount of people that voted. And what was even crazier is that the more votes that were counted, because remember, that was a whole debacle over the next
Right, that's exactly what I was going to go to next, yes.
The more votes that were counted, in all, the less votes both Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tim Canova were getting. And we were watching this happen. There was a counter. And as we were watching their votes be depleted, the more of that votes were counted generally for the next 2 to 3 days after it.
Yes. So in that 2018 midterm, what was interesting to see was there was a huge debacle that got nationwide press, finally, where Brenda Snipes was shown to, be an absolute mess. The reason it got nationwide coverage was because that vote count debacle affected more than just the race between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tim Canova.
Which is what I was saying about the 2016 election,
right?
That nobody talked about.
Right. And so then she was finally removed from office, never prosecuted. But you have this situation where instead of getting a very close margin between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tim Canova, he's capped at 5% across the board. I mean, that is unheard of, to have all of these little different areas all come at 5%. You would expect there to be different percentages in different places. So
especially
that's Greeks.
And so I was like actually at the polls on that day. And I was at the Plantation poll, which is the largest voter precinct. And when I tell you, every single person, even if they were like a loyal Democrat, even if they had voted for Hillary, they were like, oh yeah, we gotta get Debbie Wasserman Schultz out of here. I love Tim Canova. Tim's the man. Tim. I mean, the amount of people out there supporting him. Debbie Wasserman Schultz had like one. Nobody liked this woman. Even from a pragmatic perspective, like, you know what? You know, she's all right, but like we need somebody else. She's just very toxic to the party. And a lot of people feel that way. And so he didn't even win Plantation, and that was almost a sure thing for him. So, and like you said, he was capped. And that's not there's a technical term for it called fraction magic. And it's not out of the norm. And so when people, and this is what I think is super important, two points. One, if Tim didn't run as an independent, if he didn't stay true to his values and he didn't persist, like I said, in holding the establishment accountable when it came to election integrity, we would have never known, one, about just why it's almost impossible for an independent candidate to win a federal election. It was always rigged, because the one thing that Democrats and Republicans can probably both agree on is that they don't want independents getting in messing up their money supply from the corporate interests. They don't want them telling the truth about what's happening in that legislature or in the White House or in any other branch. And that's what it ultimately has seemed to come down to. But two, Brenda Snipes would still be here if Tim didn't run again. And the other two corrupt supervisors, election supervisors, would be here. But luckily, Tim's race exposed this corruption, and Ron DeSantis was able to act. And now we don't have to. Now we might legitimately have a better chance. I don't know who took over Brenda Snipes' position, but I'm sure she's probably, whoever that person is, probably gonna be a little bit more. I don't know. I might not actually want to engage in that type of behavior if it's going to garner national attention, because Tim is about to run again. So let's see what happens.
Absolutely. No, and I think it's really important to remember how important those races the two races Tim ran, and then the revelations by WikiLeaks, all three of those things are completely unique aspects of the last few years that I don't, whether Tim runs again or not, those situations were entirely unique and revelatory as to the real corruption and rigging that happens in these processes. And as you mentioned, it's not just Democrats. I mean, we had the GOP led Senate just block a bill that would have mandated paper ballot backups in case of election voting machine malfunction.
You talking about the one in the federal one?
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, that's a bad bill though. That's a bad bill.
Well, interesting. How is it?
So that's the bill. I want to make sure that I'm not misspeaking, but this is the one that was pushed by Amy Klobuchar. I think they call it like the Secure America's Elections. However, the problem is that's a worse version, a neoliberal version of Tulsi's actual election integrity bill that was introduced after Tulsi introduced her bill, and then they voted on that bill while Tulsi was at the Miami debates. They voted on their bill, that Amy Klobuchar pushed, and then introduced that. They got passed in the House. Once again, Tulsi wasn't there, and that's why they passed it without her saying anything. And by the way, they did this entire thing behind Tulsi's back. In other words, they put that entire bill together behind her back, specifically because Tulsi's bill was so damn good, integrating blockchain technology, paper backups, voter verified paper ballots, all that stuff. And it's not perfect. It can always get better, but she leaves a lot of room for the states to include further, just checks and balances tweaking, when it comes to whatever is best for the state. And that's not what Amy Klobuchar's bill does. Amy Klobuchar's bill basically leaves it so that the biggest decisions are made up to the party that is in charge at the time.
Wow.
Of that individual state.
That's fascinating. I'm glad you've educated me on that point. That's wonderful. But the one point I did want to make about the Republicans and their role in some of this is to say that, you know, between 2016 and 2018, when Brenda Snipes was found in the summary judgment that Canova was granted to have committed these various felonies in the destruction of ballots, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it was Republican leaders and authorities that did not prosecute her. It wasn't just Democrats
You are 100%
who are
correct.
responsible for not prosecuting her. So
Tim has spoken about this often. In fact, GOP people, some of the elites, were like, "Look, we want to help, but we can't," and that's because Rick Scott. I mean, not just Rick Scott, but Rick Scott at the time and other high-ranking GOP officials, they need Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida because of how big that district is, and they know that. And let's be honest, one of the reasons that this this immigration detention center for kids out here in Homestead is here is because once again, that wasn't the Republicans. Debbie Wasserman Schultz helped to make sure that got pushed through, and of course, it was Republicans and a few members, believe it or not, of Donald Trump's cabinet are profiting off of this particular immigration center. So it's not a Democrat or a Republican thing. I got mad the other day when Bernie went on Twitter and tried to pretend like it's Republicans alone who want to rig this election and suppress votes. And that's one of the reasons that I actually ultimately decided to endorse Tulsi. I mean, clearly she's given me a plethora of reasons since then, but the election integrity is my number one issue. And I feel like I've never felt like supporting Tim Canova was a waste of time, despite the fact that I knew that likely he would not win by the definitions or how the establishment defines victories, because we've always learned something. We've always gained something from Tim Canova racing, because I know that he wasn't going to stop racing after that final buzzer went off. He was going to figure out what happened, how did we get to where we're at, and how to hold somebody accountable if there was rigging. When Tulsi is ultimately faced with the same decision, I don't have any doubt in my mind that she's going to fight for every single vote. I mean, shit, look what happened when Google tried to test her. Now they're in a lawsuit for $50 million, and it's looking like they might damn well lose that lawsuit. You know, I don't know if they'll have to pay out $50 million, but I damn sure know that it's not looking good for them when one of their own employees leaks that in leaks the exact way that it was done, that she was blocked. The leaker from Project that came out on Project Veritas, the Google leak, yeah, he wrote an open letter to Tulsi explaining exactly how they were able to do that. So it's not looking good for them, but you can't know if you're going to win if you don't fight back. You can't know how corrupt the system is unless you challenge the system. I think that even with the DNC fraud lawsuit, I'm pretty sure we're about to have to go. They're weighing as to whether or not they're going to have to appeal again. But even still, just the information that Bruce Spiva said, like, we don't have to do shit that y'all want to do. We can pick whoever we want to. That information alone was worth pursuing the DNC fraud lawsuit, because that let everybody know, oh, that's how they think about us. All right, okay. You know, even Bernie running and losing, there was a victory in that, because there was at least he was trying to hold the establishment accountable, and everybody in this country finally started like, hold up, who is this establishment he keeps speaking of? And then we figured it out. So and I would have loved to see what would have happened if he would have took it a step further. But I will say that him coming up with Our Revolution and endorsing candidates like Tiffany Caban in New York and Queens, Tiffany Caban won an election and had it taken away from her. Won very clearly and decisively, and then they woke up the next day, oh damn, all these provisional ballots hadn't been counted. And what a coincidence. Even though there were 5 candidates in the race, almost and 98% of them went to the candidate that was picked by the establishment and was losing significantly to Tiffany Caban. And then those provisional ballots put her right over the top. Just like Nancy Pelosi in the jungle primary in 2018 in California came out the gate with 700,000 more votes than everybody else. Like, nobody else had one. She had 700,000 that came from early voting and provisional ballots. Dianne Feinstein came out the gate with like 1.2 million votes in that jungle primary. Nobody else had one. Like, seriously, bro. These provisional ballots are another example of they can say what the hell they want to those provisional ballots.
And
Like,
yeah, and to go to your point about the what we've gained from these races, whether it's Canova's races, whether it's Bernie's races, what we have learned as well is what happens when you go up against these political fiefdoms. I mean, if somebody like Tim Canova wanted simply to get into office, he could have run almost anywhere else in the country on his platform as a progressive. And I think unless he was in a very, very deeply red state, he would have been able to get a position in Congress. I don't doubt that for a second. But
if it was him instead of AOC in New York, it probably would have been a worse victory. Yeah.
I think that's kind of something that I take for granted, but a lot of people just are not aware of this story. And when you really look at the details and the history of what happened, you see that anyone going up against Debbie Wasserman Schultz was going to run into these issues. And by doing it anyway, he has exposed how the sausage is made within the Democratic Party on a state level, which tells us more, as you said, about the national level, because of the fact not only that she was the DNC chairwoman, but also because, I mean, she's one of the only defendants named individually on the DNC fraud lawsuit. She's the center of huge numbers of other scandals. I mean, I don't even know if we have time to get into the Iran scandal and the role that may have in keeping her somewhat protected in Congress. But to go up against that, and I would never say that anyone would run a political campaign as an individual person on their own money without intending to win. But I would say that running against someone like Debbie Wasserman Schultz on an honest platform is something that only the most courageous people would even try. And I think the fact that Tim did it was something that was really important. And that's why it angers me as a journalist that more people don't cover it. I know you did. I know I did. There are a few independent journalists that did. But the fact that establishment media, corporate media, does not cover the blatant corruption in Tim's case, the blatant corruption shown in the DNC fraud lawsuit. I mean, when you go to the corporate coverage of the DNC fraud lawsuit, you only have headlines from the Washington Post saying DNC fraud lawsuit dismissed. You have almost zero coverage of the actual proceedings of the lawsuit. And that isn't an accident. And I wanted to get your comment on that.
Yeah, like you said, it's an accident. You go through the transcripts from either of the hearings, and it's sad, honestly. You kind of like lose hope because whenever, remember when they tried to sue WikiLeaks in Russia, the DNC did, that shit was dismissed in like a month? The judge didn't even entertain it. And that says something because that didn't get headlines like that, if we're being real. And matter of fact, if I recall, when that judge dismissed that, he was very clear, like, y'all are full of shit. What you cannot do this to a journalist. You cannot do this to a publisher. So it wasn't even like a jurisdictional thing, or it was like, no, you cannot do this. And Julian Assange is innocent. Like that's literally what the case said. So when you're talking about what they tried to do, which was actually political, compared to what we were trying to do, which wasn't political as much as it was like we had legal and lawful standing to do this case. And they went up to all the details to say, well, this was dismissed for their case. This is dismissed, but here's all the important facts about the case that you should pay attention to. But then in our case, they're like, oh, just a bunch of sore loser Bernie fans who are pissed they lost, and that's it. And that's how they cover it. And it is what it is. Luckily, the mainstream media is losing a lot of its ground. I feel like now if the DNC fraud lawsuit came, like, kind of reemerge, it would be probably more popular now than it was back then. However, it was the catalyst to people forget. Like, I know we like to think that, oh, we always knew about the rigging, but people were really not catching on to the election rigging until around March or April, whenever we started, the forming of the DNC fraud lawsuit. And so from that point forward, the chips fell where they may. Bernie or bust came out. We had the protests and the rallies in Philadelphia. So we got to put lipstick on that pig and show everybody exactly what the DNC was. And if nothing else came out of that, that's it. I feel like that's just the best thing that came out of this, is that I feel like Tulsi isn't as far along as she is unless people were not pissed off at the rigging. I feel like Bernie wouldn't even have a chance this time around because if we never discovered the rigging, or if it never became a huge topic of discussion, people would have assumed that it was just business as usual, and they would have just went on and rig it again with no fear of repercussion. Now there is this hesitancy now, and because of that, like I said, people are really, at the end of the day, looking for jobs. They're looking for a paycheck, and they're going to go where that money is. Bernie has some former Hillary people. Hell, the former editor-in-chief of Think Progress, which is Center for American Progress's publication, is now his campaign manager. But according to Fies, even though I would consider him a little bit on the neoliberal side, I do believe him when he says basically there was nowhere else for anybody who even thought about progressive policies to go before 2016. And it's a different world now. So that I am thankful for, no matter what the outcome is.
Thank you so much for joining us, Niko. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we will speak again, because this is something that has not, as you say, it's not going to go away. This is something that we're going to have to keep reminding people of as we move towards 2020, because it has such a critical bearing on what we'll see, the results of those races in the Democratic primary and potentially in the general as well. So,
just getting started.
Thank you.
Thank you.